Hello and welcome everybody who have joined us just now. You're very welcome to the launch of RISE 4.1. I'm just going to hand over to the President of European Federation of Associations and Centres of Irish Studies, Professor Katarina Reinhardt, who's going to say a few words before we return to the business ahead tonight to launch this wonderful new issue.
Thanks, Sean, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our first EFACIS Roundtable discussion here tonight. As you know, thanks to our big and vibrant EFACIS community, we at EFACIS are in the happy situation of being able to initiate, run, and become involved in various exciting Irish studies projects, which are situated at the intersection of culture, research, and third-level education. Ongoing projects at present are Kaleidoscope 2, which currently publish original work by Irish authors on the topic of Europe and Ireland on a bi-weekly basis. Another project is Literature as Translation 4, translating an Enright, or of course, our Irish Itinerary podcast, which features conversations of EFACIS scholars with Irish authors and artists. In addition to these already well-established projects at the intersection of research and culture, we are currently concentrating on making our interdisciplinary research activities in the field of Irish studies more visible. The new Irish Studies Itinerary, a pan-European lecture series that connects Irish studies centres at different universities, is one such project. And we are absolutely excited and delighted that we launch today the first EFACIS Roundtable discussion, another project that we want to use to introduce research initiatives of EFACIS-related scholars, as well as our EFACIS publications. And there is no better way to launch this new series of roundtable discussions than with the launch of our latest issue of RISE, Review of Irish Studies in Europe, entitled Staging Europe at the Gate Theatre, as you all know. I'm extremely grateful to all the colleagues who are actively involved and have made this double launch possible, and I want to thank in particular James Gallagher, our EFACIS coordinator, the editors of RISE 4.1, the contributors to this issue, and of course our new general editor of RISE, Sean Crossan, whom, even though he certainly needs no introduction, I will briefly introduce. Dr. Sean Crossan is Senior Lecturer in Film in the Houston School of Film and Digital Media, leader of the Sport and Exercise Research Group, and co-director of the MA Sports Journalism and Communication program in NUI Galway. Sean's research today has focused primarily in the areas of Irish studies, particularly literature and film, and sports cinema, and his publications include the monographs Gaelic Games on Film, published in 2019, Sport and Film, 2013, and the co-edited collections Towards 2016, 1916, and Irish Literature, Culture and Society, published in 2015, and Contemporary Irish Film, New Perspectives on a National Cinema, 2011. Sean Crossan is also a former president of EFACIS and a series co-editor of EFACIS academic publications series Irish Studies in Europe, ISE, as well as, of course, the general editor of EFACIS online journal Review of Irish Studies in Europe. Thank you again, Sean, for all the work you've invested in EFACIS and RISE, and for initiating and organizing this first roundtable discussion. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for the really great, extraordinary leadership you've shown in EFACIS and support you've given to the development of this journal and the various EFACIS publications there now is, and projects. There's so many projects that there are now. I'm just going to speak very briefly before I'll hand over to the issue editors, just to say a little bit about our journal, the Review of Irish Studies in Europe, or RISE journal. We are an international open access peer-reviewed multidisciplinary journal. Of course, our focus is on the area of Irish studies, but we're dedicated to the publication of new and innovative research within and between the broad range of disciplines, of course, that are engaged with Irish studies today, including literature in both English and the Irish language, history, film, visual culture, politics, translation studies, music studies, and social sciences. We publish both multidisciplinary issues with contributions from researchers in specific disciplines, and as well as non-themed issues for which we particularly welcome interdisciplinary research work. If you have any submissions or ideas for themed issues, they'll be very welcome. So if you wanted to send in either themed issue proposals or proposals for or submissions for non-themed issues, you can email us at rise@efacis.eu. And we also accept some proposals for review articles. If you have any, to our review editor, Professor Sylvia Mikowski at risereviews@efacis.eu, and I'll share that information in the chat shortly. We've been in existence now for a little over 4 years, and I'm delighted to say that this will be our 7th issue, which we're launching tonight. Of course, bringing a journal together is not possible without the input of a huge number of people, of a really huge contribution by our editorial board. And I just wanted to mention the board, and I'm delighted that some of the editorial board have been able to join us tonight, including Dr. Joost Augustine from Leiden University in Belgium, Professor Elke Docher from KU Leuven in Belgium, Professor Sylvia Mikowski from the University of Reims-Champagne Ardennes in France, Professor Kathy Reinhardt, who you've just heard, from the University of Wuppertal in Germany, and Dr. Daniela Tianova from Charles University in Prague. And that's the team that have been critical to the production and the development of RISE in the past year. And we've recently we've relaunched the platform, and this is our first issue in a reconvened editorial after the work that our previous general editor, Professor Shane McCobie Murphy, to whom we're grateful for his vision initially to start and to develop the journal for previous issues. Kathy has also already mentioned James Gallagher, our EFACIS coordinator. I want to thank him for his input as well on the technical side and the editing side on this issue and on the platform, as well as the intern Jing Young and the work that she has done for us in developing the journal. Before I hand over to the editors, I just want to thank them sincerely for the work they've done in bringing together what I think is a really a valuable and immensely impressive issue that we're extremely proud to be able to include within the RISE journal. It provides, I believe, a fascinating and timely insight, accompanied by some stunning images as well, for those of you who'd like to look and to explore the journal online at this issue. And of course, focused on one of Ireland's greatest cultural institutions, the Gate Theatre. Just to say very briefly before I hand over to Siobhan, a little bit about the editors. So the editors of this issue are Dr. Siobhan O'Gorman, who's a senior lecturer in the College of Arts at the University of Lincoln, author of Theatre, Performance and Design, Scenographies in a Modernising Ireland, a forthcoming work, and co-editor of Devised Performance in Irish Theatre, Histories and Contemporary Practices. She's joined in co-editing this issue on Staging Europe at the Gate by Dr. Elaine Sisson, who's a cultural historian and senior lecturer in visual culture at the National Film School at IAT in Dublin, and programme co-chair of the BA Design for Stage and Screen And she's also contributed to a wide range of publications, include Pearce's Patriots and Ireland Design and Visual Culture, Negotiating Modernity 1922 to 1992. And finally, the third co-editor of this issue is Ian R. Walsh, who's lecturer in drama and theatre studies at NUI Galway. He has previously, his publications include Experimental Irish Theatre after W.B. Yeats, which was published by Palgrave in 2012, and co-edited with Mary Caulfield the collection Cultural Convergence to Dublin Gate Theatre 1928 to 1960. So I'll allow the editors to introduce the contributors. I'm delighted that so many of the contributors have been able to join us tonight to contribute to this session. So I'll hand over at this point to Siobhan. And again, thank you all for the extraordinary work you've done in bringing this wonderful issue together.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Sean. And you've done a little bit of my work for me in introducing our first speaker on this panel, who is Ian R. Walsh. So that's great. So I'm going to use this moment before we move on to remind those in attendance that if you're on Facebook, you can use the Facebook chat to ask a question and they'll be fielded back to us. And if you want to ask and you're in the Zoom session here, please use the raise hand function or type your name in the chat if you'd like to ask it verbally, or you can indeed type a question in the chat. But we would ask you to keep all questions to the end of the panel, as it can be quite distracting for the speakers if they're popping into the chat while they're speaking. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ian R. Walsh again, my co-editor for this special issue. We've heard already that he is author of a number of publications, and Sean has introduced him, and I'm going to hand over to Ian now. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. So what I want to do is just to share my screen and just to show some images in this sort of brief overview of my article. So hopefully we can all see this now, and I will, here we go, yeah. So just to begin with the origins of my particular piece. So the article that's in this collection is called Commedia dell'arte and the Gate Theatre. And it came about, I guess, from my fascination and my love of this logo, this old logo that the Gate had, where we see Harlequin here kind of pushing back the gates of theatre, the comedy and the tragedy there represented. And you see that it's Harlequin from the kind of motley trousers there. And that was a design by MacLeamore. And then also I also have a kind of a deep regard for an affection for Hilton Edwards' Mantle of Harlequin, which is his book on stagecraft. And as you can tell from the title as well there, Commedia dell'arte plays a big role in that book. And indeed, the second half of that book involves a discussion between a harlequin and an amateur player. So as you can see from those two pieces, I guess, Commedia is central, I think, to both of these men's works. And that's what prompted me to have a look at the Commedia and the Gate. And what I learned, I guess, through this investigation is how much the Commedia dell'arte is central to everything that they did. It offered both MacLeamore and Edwards a historical precedent of stagecraft, for a historical precedent for the kind of theatre that they would like to make. It was a performance tradition based in improvisation and not the literary text. So automatically it kind of associated the Gate with kind of a non-literary theatre, setting them up somewhat in opposition to the dominant Abbey theatre with its literary tradition. And it was also very much a European tradition, obviously coming from its origins in Italy, where the Commedia spread throughout Europe and over the decades, each kind of it changed in the different national contexts. And then also, particularly through its iteration through kind of modernist artists and modernist theatre practice, particularly the Ballet Russe, I think, and their production of Carnaval, which was a ballet that involved Commedia characters, it also provided a space of what we would now call queerness. because the ballet race production, I guess, in particular, had an emphasis on the dynamic male body, and also had these particular interpretations of Harlequin and Piero that offered two different queer identities. Piero, the effeminate, ineffectual male, the pale and poetic one, and the Harlequin, then the kind of mischievous, virile trickster figure. So both men, interestingly, in their work, donned the masks of Harlequin and Piero throughout their careers, both on stage and in their writings. And I think Piero as well, that particular character, is the only role that both of them actually may have played or shared. And in the article, I build on the work of Ivor Walsh and Richard Pine in particular in relation to MacLiamore and how he used masks of Wilde in a way to navigate a public queer identity. And I argue that both MacLiamore and Edwards also use the masks of Piero and Harlequin the same way to, in a way, hide in plain sight a queer identity in a deeply conservative Catholic country. And you'll see in the image here is a picture of Hilton Edwards playing Piero in Ivanhoff's A Merry Death, which was a short piece that was produced as part of a Christmas review show in 1943 called Masquerade. And you see the program there as well, with a design by MacLiamore of a Harlequin bowing with this very large bouquet of flowers. And indeed, the Harlequin recurs throughout MacLiamore's design work. This is also interesting, this particular production, because MacLiamore would have played the Harlequin opposite the Piero that Edwards was playing in this particular production. So I also in the article look at productions that were influenced by the Commedia style. One most famous of these being their 1946 production of The Merchant of Venice, in which they transposed the action of Shakespeare's play to the 18th century, and they had a kind of a meta-theatrical device of a chorus of Commedia characters who helped with transitions of scenes and moved props around, also took part in kind of a carnival within it. And then there's a picture there. I can just briefly read you here what they say here is that the ingenious history of Portia and the Jew is offered as a bouquet by the figures of the Italian Commedia dell'arte with Pieros, Columbine, Doctors, and Pulcinellos, to say nothing of a Harlequin whose wand transforms the scenes from ghetto to palace and from canal-side streets to the gardens of Belmont in full view of the audience. And you see a picture there also of Edwards as Shylock. And then my last image, and I'm aware that I have to move on with time here, is there was another production then, just interesting just to say on The Merchant of Venice that they both considered that their favorite or their most successful production of Shakespeare, actually, because of the Commedia device. And I talk about that in the article as well. And then I also end the piece looking at their production of Goldoni, A Servant of Two Masters in 1973, directed by Hilton Edwards and then designed by Micheál MacLiamore, where they were praised very much for their kind of mastery of the knockabout farce in this piece, but generally it kind of lacked the touch of Harlequin's wand, I guess, to make it anything that kind of rose above that. But ultimately, the article argues that through the Commedia at the gate, we can see how European stage practice was very much at the to the fore in Irish theatre practice, and it really kind of challenges maybe some of the received wisdom of the past on Irish theatre history that says that, you know, that Irish theatre was very parochial in its stagecraft and indeed kind of narrowly nationalistic in its subject matter. So this particular study has that wider context maybe of challenging some of those perceptions and narratives. That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Ian, and really important to have those perspectives, I think. I'm now going to hand over to our next panellist, who is Joan Fitzpatrick-Dean. She is Curator's Teaching Professor of English Emerita at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where she taught film and drama and served as Dean of Libraries, Director of Honours and Department Chair. Her publications on drama and film have appeared internationally, and they include her monograph, All Dressed Up, Modern Irish Historical Pageantry, Riot and Great Anger, 20th Century Stage Censorship in Ireland, Dancing at Lunasa, David Hare, Tom Stoppard, Comedy as Moral Matrix, and forthcoming, I think, or it might be out by now, is this lovely book, Pageant, which I can't wait to get my hands on. She also co-edited Beyond Realism, Experimental and Unconventional Irish Drama Since the Revival with Jose Lanterns, and she was a Fulbright Scholar at University College Galway and a Fulbright Lecturer at Université de Nancy. And I'm going to hand you over to Joan now.
Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you to all the editors for working to bring this to fruition. You can hear me, I assume? Yes, okay, good. So the piece that I have contributed deals with Hilton Edwards, Brecht, and the Brechtian. And it started out, or it most recently came from a presentation I made at the GATE Research Network in January of this year. And the emphasis shifted quite a bit from that time until it reached this particular point. I had become more interested in Hilton Edwards, and especially in Hilton Edwards as an Englishman, and he always described himself as an Englishman. And if, McLeamore can be described as a man who picked up an Irish identity, constructed one for himself, I think that almost in contradistinction, Edwards constructed an English identity for himself. I also have been interested for a long time in the way in which there are very, very different ideas and attitudes about the 1950s that you find when you look at America, when you look at Britain, and when you look at Ireland and other countries. And in America, it seems to me it's the plainest. On the one hand, you get TV sitcoms like Happy Days and movies like Back to the Future that celebrate this as the 50s as this wonderful, wonderful time. And then on the other hand, you have the Crucible and the McCarthy investigations. So you have very different ideas. And you find this in Ireland as well. I mean, for John Banville, it is a terrible, terrible time. But for others, they see it as a real opening up. I had written an article about Beckett and his ambivalence towards Ireland, his reception in Ireland. And I'm delighted that that's going to be reprinted. It originally appeared in the Hungarian Journal for English and American Studies, and it's going to go online. But in any case, then I looked at the GATE was always involved in taking chances and in putting one over. And when you go back and you begin to look at the political content of the plays leading up to their production of Brecht, you begin to see that repeatedly Hilton Edwards and McLeamore are offering Ireland an international perspective on politics, so that issues anti-Semitism in, for instance, Lennox Robinson's Roly-Poly, or the isolationism. They do a production of Robert Audrey's Thunder Rock, which is very popular and supported by the government in Britain. It's a play that argues against American isolationism. And then right after the war, they do Lillian Hellman's Watch on the Rhine, also an anti-fascist, anti-isolationist argument. And I think that when Hilton Edwards sees the Berliner Ensemble in London in '56, he begins to discover in Brecht a new voice. And it's a voice that frees him from, you know, someone who's simply looking back and trying to recuperate the Elizabethan stage or earlier staging techniques. He's got an entirely new modern vocabulary. This, I argue, frees Hilton Edwards up to do a series of radio broadcasts that in turn leads to the Mantle and Harlequin, which in turn leads to the 1959 production of Mother Courage, and then the 1961 production of St. Joan of the Stockyards at the Gate. So that, in short, is, I think, at the heart of my argument. I'll leave you, if I can just try briefly to share my screen and to show you a few of the images that got me started in this, because I could not include these. These are at Northwestern, and this is a design for Mahler and the Gentleman of the Meat Markets for St. Joan. Oops, I've stopped doing that, but I have exceeded my time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that gives us an opportunity then to have some questions for our panel. So I'm going to open it up firstly to the floor. Are there any questions for Ian or for Joan? And if not, then I can ask a question or two.
Hi, sorry, I had a question. Try to raise the hand. I don't know how you prefer to go about with this, like with. Okay.
You can either raise your hand or type your name in the chat, or type your question in the chat.
Yes, I had a question for John. Well, first of all, thanks for your presentation, which was very fascinating. And then about the reception of Brecht at the Gate. In terms of seeing it as a political performance, the reception of Brecht in that very early stage, so when Brecht had just died or was at the very end of his life and career, well, it was still tied to thinking that whoever was talking about Brecht had to be positioned in a very specific side of the political spectrum. Brecht was the communist playwright per excellence. At the time, those trends that were especially strong in America to sort of depoliticize Brecht and just see his method as something that was appealing to the experience of living in modernity and not the class conflict, were pretty strong. So I was just wondering how this was reflected in the two productions you analyzed, like how they treated the political material and the quite explicit thematization of class issues in Brecht's texts.
Of course, I did not see either of these productions. So what I imagine is speculative and based on the reviews. I don't think that they were Marxist pieces. I think that one of the things that was going on with both productions was you could see Hilton Edwards freed up to use song as Brecht had used it in Threepenny Opera. He's going to be using it. There's, you know, an even more elaborate musical accompaniment. In terms of the reception, most of the reviews of Mother Courage do not see it as a political play. There's one possible exception. When it comes to St. Joan, however, there's one review that's going to denounce Brecht as a, you know, godless communist atheist. But the politics are really soft pedaled, I think, from in the reviews as well as I suspect in the production. As I say, I didn't see the production, but and that's why the title of my article is Hilton Edwards, Brecht and the Brechtian, because the Brechtian becomes a really commodious term. Not just in Ireland, but I think it's one of Brecht's great contributions to theater history is that term Brechtian. because it can include so many different things. Does that answer your question? It's
Yes,
not at all a complete answer. More answers lie in the article itself.
And I'm looking forward to read it. If I'm not taking up too much time, just a very, very short follow-up. You said that the musical, like the musical side of the productions was very elaborated. If I'm not wrong, for Johanna, only Johann, there should be some music written by Kurt Weill.
Yes.
Did they use that in the original production?
Yes,
or
they
did.
did.
Come up with?
They did, yeah. Thank you for that, Francesco. Ian, I did have a question for you as well, but I am clocking that we're out of time for this panel. But we can chat anytime. So I'm going to hand over to you now to chair the next panel, if that's okay. And thank you very much, Joan and Ian. I think what you did there was really cleverly to tease people to go and read your fascinating articles. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Siobhan. And I was just delighted to share some of those lovely archival images with people. And again, as Joe just did there, I will direct you to the journal, which you can obviously access free online. So please do, and you'll get a chance to read all these things. I want to move on and introduce you to some more of the lovely articles that we have in this particular collection. Our issue, and indeed the contributors that have written them are going to talk to you a little bit about them. We're moving up time-wise, I guess, in this particular section where we're going to look at Europe and the contemporary Gate. And the first speaker that we have is Barry Houlihan. And just to tell you a little bit about Dr. Barry Houlihan, he is an archivist at National University of Ireland, Galway. Barry teaches theatre history and archives, digital cultures and history. Barry is the editor of Navigating Ireland's Theatre Archive, Theory, Practice and Performance, and contributes regularly to RTE Brainstorm. I regularly see him come up on the little app and his great stories there, which is fantastic, on topics of theatre, literature and cultural and archival heritage. His monograph, Theatre and Archival Memory, Irish Drama and Marginalised Histories 1951 to 1977 is hot off the press and you need to get it. Barry has recently co-edited the journal Shaw and Legacy in Shaw, the Journal of Bernard Shaw Studies. Current projects also include the Tune Mother and Baby Home Oral History Archive, and recent online curated exhibitions include the Genevieve Lyons Globe Theatre Archive, and indeed Joe Vanek, who we have the privilege of joining us today, his archive of theatre and opera design, co-curated with Grace Vrooman. And indeed, Grace Vrooman could unfortunately not make it today, but she also co-wrote this article with Barry, which was entitled A Stage of Transition. Hold on now, I've lost my notes as you loaded those images. A Stage of Transition, Locating European Identity, Culture and Memory at the Gate Theatre, Frank McGuinness's The Threepenny Opera, and Peer Gynt and Hugo Hamilton's The Speckled People. I will pass you over now to Barry.
Great, thanks so much, Ian. And indeed, thanks so much to Siobhan and Elaine, as well as editors of the journal. Really delighted to be in there. And of course, I'm speaking solo tonight. I don't have the pleasure of my great co-author on this article, Grace Vrooman, for very good reasons can't make this evening, is busy rehearsing in a real theatre, which I'm sure we're all a little bit jealous of as well. So I'll try and do justice for Grace's great work as well this evening. So to begin with, looking at this paper, which we talked about, A Stage of Transition, Grace and I were thinking about various aspects, of course, of the Gate and Europe, and how those two things overlapped and intersected, of course, since the foundation of the Gate itself in 1928, but perhaps also looking to more contemporary years as well, because obviously that connection between Europe and the Gate and between Ireland and the continent certainly didn't lessen in the context of the Gate Theatre over those years. And a few things influenced the direction that Grace and I took with the paper. And again, in our discussions, we kind of kept coming back to this position or this stance of the Gate being a stage of transition, to use the title of the paper, but I suppose a place of a pivot as well, around where various ideas kind of crucible together and were thrown in a mix between Irishness and European memory and culture and identity. So when we started looking into the case studies we were going to be about examining, again, a few themes that were coming up was that it wasn't just about the Gate touring Irish works into Europe or touring European works into the continent, or conversely just about receiving European works into Dublin, but rather it was a mix of all these things. And as I said, it was a gate as a stage, a pivot around which ideas of Irishness, Irish identity were constructed or reconstructed as cosmopolitan, international, Irish European, and likewise when European works came into Dublin via the gate stage. Again, this dialogue between Ireland and Europe was very much ongoing. And again, this was very much around a stance of, or performance of migration, migration of ideas, of works, of theatrical form, of audiences as well, but of course the people in the plays of which were staged. And again, in the before times, in the pre-COVID times, Grace was able to spend the semester at NUI Galway on an Erasmus Plus program, fittingly European funded program, where we were able to examine the Gate Theatre digital archive in more detail at NUIG. And of course, the archive of theatre and opera design of none other than Joe Vanek, of course, part of this session tonight, and part of the journal as well, with his own great piece. And I had the very great privilege of working on Joe's archive at NUIG, cataloguing its records from his designs, photographs, notebooks, and research files, with Grace then digitizing the material and creating a great online exhibition from Joe's archive. And again, we drew on a lot of that work for the paper. And again, the plays we wanted to examine included Hugo Hamilton's, sorry, the adaptation of Hugo Hamilton's memoir, The Speckled People, staged at the Gate in 2011, directed by Patrick Mason, and which of course was designed by Joe Vanek. And then of course some other recent contemporary Gate plays which were adapted from European works, including Frank McGuinness's adaptation of Ibsen's Peer Gynt in 1988, and again the 2014 production of Bertolt Brecht's and Kurt Weill's The Threepenny Opera, again adapted by Frank McGuinness. And this was the real central premise of the paper across all these case studies was, yes, this question of migration, but also perhaps the question of identity and home, and that representation of perhaps that most Irish thing of all on the Irish stage, the home place. Where we began actually was a little bit earlier again, was at the 1952 production of the Gate, the Gate's Hamlet in Elsinore at Cronborg Castle in 1952, and how this production was identifiably Irish, but also firmly supported by the Irish state as a form of cultural form or soft power, or cultural diplomacy for the newly established Irish Republic. And again, within the Gates archive is not just this promotional shot, but other records from the production in 1952. And the play program itself was particularly interesting for, as I suppose, a way to access the original production context. And again, the dueling nationalities of Irishness and European, and the authenticity of the Gate as an Irish theatre performing European or British canonical works in Europe. And an article within that play program was by the critic Gabriel Fallon, and this was entitled Ireland's Hamlet for Elsinore, outlining how the Gate was invited to perform the play at Elsinore, again the first Irish company to do so. The tour was supported financially and administratively by the Irish Cultural Relations Committee on behalf of the Irish government, and that programme again also included an article by Frank Aiken, the Irish Minister for External Affairs, who was outlining in his article the success, or not just the success, of the Gate Theatre over the previous 25 years, but also recognised the Gate's contribution to the standards of Irish acting and production within Europe. And the quote from Aiken's article about how the tradition now firmly established in Elsinore was also mirrored by the Gate. And again, interesting, Aiken signs off in his article in his Irish form as Prunchos Mac Égon, giving credence to this was the Gate's Irish credentials in Europe. The Speckled People then more recently had its premiere at the Gate Theatre as part of the Dublin Theatre Festival in October 2011, adapted for the stage by the one of the piece from the 52 Gate production. A Danish friend thankfully translated this for me, and it was about the reliability or the authenticity of production. That two things were identifiable as reliable: the British or performances of Shakespeare, and also Dunlop Tires, both being reliably British. And it was just funny, if not also interesting, that the Gate were subverting this form of a canonical, form of what was authentic Shakespearean drama. They were an Irish company coming from Dublin to perform it at Elsinore. So yeah, The Speckled People, as I was just saying, again adapted from Hamilton's memoir. Directed by Patrick Mason, and it tells Hamilton's own experience from the childhood perspective of growing up with a German mother and a strict Irish nationalist father who had moved from Germany to Ireland. And in a note on the play, Hamilton recounts how, and I quote, adapting the memoir to the Gate stage was not so much a retelling, but a completely new way of explaining childhood chaos, of a split culture and identity that Hamilton himself had experienced through a dual nationality that he then represented through the young boy Hanny in the play. And again, Joe's designs, I think, do great justice to that vast world of the child's mind and the imagination as how they process these great movements and great migrations between not just countries but between cultures as well. I think one other image here from Joe's archive, and this was labeled an alternate drawing, and perhaps Joe himself can confirm that. I'm not sure if this image made it into the play itself. There is a report.
It did, but it was reversed. It was white on black because there were black boards with chalk. The actual images were drawn as if in chalk on a blackboard. So this was the first preliminary sketch.
Great. I mean that's the value in Joe's papers, that these early forms, the early ideas before they are manifested on stage are so well documented and so clear, allowing us to trace the gestation of design of Hamilton's memoir, but also and specifically from Hamilton's point of view, that the story is told from the child's perspective. And again, to quote from Hanny in the play, when you're small, you know nothing. You don't know who you are or where you are or what questions to ask. When I was small, I woke up in Germany. When I looked outside my window, I saw Ireland. My mother speaks German. My father speaks Irish. Outside the front door is another country where they speak English. And again, there's real humor in the play as well, where the idea of dueling nationalities are kind of played out ad nauseum, where the boy receives a present of a pair of German lederhosen to wear, and that is matched by a present from his father of an Aran jumper, and that he then realizes he's German on the bottom and Irish on top. But I think all these records, I think especially Joe's design records, just give us this great viewpoint into reconstructing these very recent histories as well, not just theatrical histories, but contemporary social records as well, or social histories as well. In the play, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of trauma received by the childhood through nightmares and so on. And not long after the play was produced, of course, our news feeds were full of tragic images of migration across the Mediterranean. And I think most notably of all, the one tragically iconic image of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi, a Syrian refugee whose body tragically washed up on the beach. All these images of the child is often lost, and that childhood perspective on migration and the lasting impacts of migration are sadly not always documented. And I think The Speckled People does a great job of examining these legacies of migration linguistically, culturally, and also socially. But again, all these works, and again, Grace has examined so many other important aspects as well, especially with Brecht and Ibsen through McGuinness's adaptations, which is all in the journal. And I just urge anyone to go and read Grace's great insights as well. But perhaps to wrap up on a point which was made by Selena Carmel in her 2017 program announcement at the Gate, even the symbolism of announcing that season program as being called the season of the outsider. As Selena so well phrased it, we are all outsiders in some way, and the Gate, through bridging many forms of borders, by culturally, linguistically, socially, and so on, and by functioning as a stage of transition, as it did and still does today, serves to bridge those gaps between Ireland and Europe. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, Barry, for that. And we'll just hold questions. Sorry, yeah. We'll just hold questions for the moment. As I said, we'll have questions at the end after our next speaker. So just to introduce our next speaker, give me a second. It is Francesco Sani, who has earned an MPhil in Theatre and Performance at Trinity College Dublin in 2020 and is currently conducting a PhD at De Montfort University in Leicester. His research, which is practice-based in nature, focuses on the application of the Brechtian Lehrstück, or didactic play, in the contemporary cultural industry, especially in relation to the thematization of the political economy. His broader research interests include musical theatre and political performance in the contemporary cultural industry. He also works as a playwright and a director. The title of Francesco's article in the journal is A Stage for the Outsiders of Neoliberal Capitalism, Dublin's Gate Theatre, European Austerity, and #Waking the Feminists. So I think Barry nicely transitioned us, if that's a phrase, to Francesco by already talking about that season of Selina Cartman's plays. But Francesco, if you could now take it away and tell us about your paper.
Yes, thanks, Ian. So, yes, basically my paper explores an aspect that is a bit more problematic in regard to the relation of Europe and the Gate, and we could say Europe and Irish theatre, or Europe and Ireland more in general. And this concerns the implementation of certain European policies, especially austerity policies, that have had a very strong impact on the cultural industry and on the possibility of thematizing very prominent and very felt issues in the contemporary cultural industry, in the contemporary theater industry. The reason why I relate these reflections to the Gate Theatre and to a very specific moment of the history of the Gate, namely the transition from Michael Colgan's direction to Selina Cartmell's in 2017, is because this moment has been quite illustrative of the way in which these conditions created by austerity policies could affect some quite radical initiatives within the cultural industry. As I argue, it is very interesting to see that after the rise to prominence of #Waking the Feminists, the movement born to protest and oppose the marginalization of women in Irish theatre, a figure that is extremely sympathetic to Waking the Feminist, and we could say to an extent even very much involved in it, like Selina Cartmell, immediately gets to run one of the major cultural institutions of the nation. I also outline that she essentially did a good job in making the Gate Theatre an institution that gives more space to women, gives more space to narratives of marginalized subjects, and to production methodologies that had not really been the center of Colgan's agenda in the previous years. But what I also underline is that there seems to be a rather ambiguous dynamic, namely the fact that political themes are often evoked but never really treated in a sort of very thorough way in productions, and that spaces for productions that would result more commercial and less engaged are always the more important ones. Most importantly, I outlined this in the 2018 season, which was the first presented by Cartmell as an artistic direction and was titled The Outsiders season. And that's where you get the title of the article. And I showed this with a contrast between the very first production of the season, namely a very Brechtian staging of Look Back in Anger by John Osborne, which I argue is pretty strong because it calls into argument a lot of problems connected to the depiction of women in canonical texts, the depiction of women on the stage, and all that had been some themes that had been associated with the recent history of the Gate. And then I also underlined that a much less challenging production in this regard, namely the production of Hamlet for the 2018 Dublin Theatre Festival, was essentially received the spotlight. And yes, this is basically what I talk about. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Francesco, for that. What's lovely about these two articles side by side is I guess, you know, how both of them really directly address the title of the journal, the idea and the complexities of staging Europe on the Irish stage and what that brings. So in the case studies that Barry and Grace look at in their article, we very much are looking at the complex interplay of the national and the international relation to identity, I think. But then in Francesco's piece then as well, it's perhaps more to do with the kind of complex interplay of kind of ideologies of how a national grassroots movement in a way, such as #WakingTheFeminists, kind of rubs up against the market forces and the kind of neoliberal agenda of marketability. So there's that I think really interesting navigation in both pieces of those that kind of complex interplay of both outsider and insider within the national and the international, the European and the Irish, which is really nicely teased out. I'll just see if there's any questions from anybody here. But actually, what I might do as well is, rather than asking our panelists some questions, and we're running out of time a little bit, is I'm aware that Finian O'Gorman is now with us. So I might actually also ask maybe Finian if he might come into our conversation and maybe tell us a little bit about his paper, which his article, which we missed out on earlier, if Barry and Francesco wouldn't mind. And then I'll also just check the chat as well to see if there's any questions following that. So Finian, are you there?
I am indeed. I had a sinking feeling that I had got the time wrong and quickly scanned the email and saw the very important piece of information of Brussels beside the time. So my apologies to everyone.
Although you're completely on theme with this idea of, you know, there's two time zones, there's two identities, Anyway, I won't labor that point. Finian, you've already been introduced in your absence, so I won't introduce you again, but just to say that you are a teaching academic in my own institution at NUI Galway. But if you want to tell us a little bit about your own article on moral laverty and soap opera.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the focus of the article is Moral Laverty's 1951 play Tolka Row, which was premiered by Gate Theatre Productions and which, alongside Laverty's other play Liffey Lane, was crucial to the financial survival of the company over that period. And a further testament to the popularity of Tolka Row was in the 1960s, it was adapted to become the first soap opera on Irish television. So that's what initially drew me to the play in the context of a journal issue that was looking at the relationship between the Gate Theatre and Europe, because rightly or wrongly, I'd always assumed that relationship was exclusively defined on the basis of the production of experimental avant-garde work. I guess whether it likes it or not, the Gate is responsible also for the emergence of television soap opera in Ireland. So I found that interesting and worthy of focus. But it's not just the popularity of Tolka Row that I think should be noted. There are formal aspects of it that represent some of the most effective elements of what soap opera has to offer. And chief among those is the combination of the mundane and everyday alongside the dramatic or melodramatic or the less realistic. So we can see that in Tolka Row, and that the main storyline, the more dramatic or even melodramatic storyline, revolves around Rita Nolan, who invites her elderly father to live with her and her family. It doesn't work out, and it culminates in the melodramatic, tragic death of her father at the climax of the play. So that's the box office draw, the main storyline, and yet arguably the real business of the play is in the everyday, almost throwaway, mundane conversations that take place between the women in the play. And through those conversations, the play sheds light on some of the most pressing issues relating to the lives of women during this period. So they mention access to and knowledge of contraception, sexual consent within marriage, sexual harassment, and employment issues such as the marriage bar, which I believe was still in place at the time. So, like, on the record, Tulkerrow looks like, you know, an almost frivolous piece of entertainment designed to put bums on seats. And yet when we peel back those layers, we see that actually it had some very important things to say about Irish society and Irish culture. And in the course of the research process, I discovered that the impactful potential that Tulkerrow had was not necessarily recognized or acknowledged by Hilton Edwards and Micheál Mac Liammóir. And we could see this in the prompt scripts for the play, where key passages of those conversations between the women characters in the play are cut. And each of the passages relate specifically to these potentially contentious issues, such as sexual consent within marriage and access to contraception. So this is particularly surprising in the context of a theatre that made its name with the production of risque material, you know, with daring and with innovation. So perhaps, you know, they were willing to take risks with more avant-garde work, but less so when it came to popular work. And, you know, with that, we see a historical example of a trend that persists to today, where people either overlook or disregard the extent to which popular forms can say something meaningful about the way we live our lives. And just a final thing I'd say about the article is, you know, that process of discovery in the archive highlighted the importance of archival research to this kind of work, particularly in the context of retrieving previously neglected playwrights, in that it really shed light on the fact that theatre is a collaborative process, and collaborative processes can involve hierarchies that are not necessarily evident in a finished product, whether that's a published script or a performance or any other type of art form. So that we need to be wary about making assumptions about a playwright's outlook or even their artistic process based on a single piece of evidence, even if it seems highly worthy, like in the case of a published script. That's the gist of the article, and it's one that I really enjoyed researching, and I hope that that comes through in the writing, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have it read, hopefully, so please read it.
Thanks so much, Finian. And as you said yourself, I guess there, the piece speaks to a lot of the contemporary as well, and indeed speaks to the other two papers, other two articles that we have on this panel, in terms of, I guess, that navigation of the popular and the kind of marketable and the avant-garde, and how those kind of binaries, I guess, between those two that are sometimes created are very unhelpful in terms of research, and actually perhaps audiences don't even see things that much in relation to those. But it reminds me that, you know, that when you talk about the Moral Laverty's piece, how it also relates to perhaps, you know, the 2018 production of The Snapper that Francesco talks about in his article, or indeed even the celebrity status of bringing in Marianne Faithfull to Frank McGuinness's production of the Threepenny Opera that Barry and Grace talk about as well. Time is against us, so I'm going to move on and introduce the next panel, and pass over now to, well, I'm not going to introduce, I'm going to pass it over now to Elaine. Just to say on that last note that Finian mentioned about archives, I think another huge thing about archives is that it's really helping us, and something that's coming through, I think, in this particular journal, is in terms of being able to document and talk about practice in particular as well. So that's my nice transition now to hopefully for this new panel on scenography. So I'll pass over to you, Elaine.
Thank you, Ian. Very elegantly done. Thank you very much. Welcome to the panel on scenography and the gate. We've got 3 people, so I'm not going to invite them to speak individually, but I'm actually going to throw questions at them in turn. So who we have is, we have Siobhan O'Gorman, who you've already been introduced to, and we also have Chris Moran, and we have Joe Vanek. And just to give you a little bit of background about well, Siobhan is a co-editor of the journal, and she's also a senior lecturer at the University of Lincoln. And her work on theatre design and costume design particularly is really important in foregrounding these kind of practices within theatre history, because it's often something that gets overlooked. And she does have a book coming out on scenography, history of scenography in Ireland, which is going to be fantastic. Chris Moran is a theatre director and writer. He graduated from NUI Galway and then has an MFA from the Lir at Trinity in theatre directing. And he has worked as a theatre director and as a producer at Abbey Theatre and Wexford Festival Opera. And Joe's contribution to the journal is beautifully illustrated, including a lovely cover image from one of Joe's designs for Hugo Hamilton's The Mariner. And so what I thought was interesting about the three of you really is that you all have looked at the voice, really, the voice, whether that be a visual voice, if I can say that, or the actual voice in memoirs, or your own voice in terms of theatre design practice. And I thought that, the designers that you're looking at, Joe, your own work, Siobhan, the work of Molly McEwen, the Scottish theatre designer who worked with MacLeamore and Edwards at the Gate in the 1930s and 40s, but then who went on to have a very successful theatre design career in the Citizens in Glasgow, and spent the rest of her kind of professional life really working in Scotland. And then the work of MacLeamore particularly being influenced by the work of Edward Gordon Craig, which is something that that Chris focuses on. So I think chronologically, I'm going to kind of go to you first, Chris, if you don't mind. And perhaps, there's a few things here, because I think what's interesting here is the relationship of the designer, obviously, to the writer, but also designers to other designers that comes through here. And MacLeamore and Craig, it's a very interesting relationship that they have. And I thought, could I ask you a little bit to talk a little bit about what you explore in your article in relation to that relationship?
Absolutely, yeah. So, really, it kind of feels strange to try to talk about scenography, because for me, a big obstacle in writing this article was that access to primary materials was very difficult, because, well, first off, because of the pandemic. So even the National Library of Ireland that you might want to access to see Hilton Edwards working notebooks was unavailable. I couldn't go to Galway, although there is a lot of digitization of later gate work there, and Barry was helpful at the beginning of my research. And then also Gordon Craig's archives are really spread all over the world, from Paris to Florence to Eton College in Windsor to Austin, Texas. And Micheál MacLeamore, as many of us know, his papers are with Hilton Edwards in Illinois at the Northwestern University. So really I was going a lot on secondary sources, on biographies and memoirs between them. And I kind of found myself trying to write around the scenography. So rather than do a comparison between them, which I do think is something that I think would be worthwhile doing in the future when we have more access after the pandemic. But really what I found myself doing was looking at their shared beliefs and their performances of self. So like we said, Micheál MacLeamore invented a kind of personality for himself of an Irish actor, learned to speak Irish fluently from Cork. But he also maintained this kind of Wildian presentation of himself as kind of a effeminate kind of quasi-Victorian actor, whereas Gordon Craig was actually a Victorian actor who, because of his long life, managed to live until the 60s. And Gordon Craig invented a personality. Well, he invented nearly 100 personalities in his paper, his magazine, The Mask. So I began kind of comparing and contrasting the realities and the masks that they invented for themselves. But what really united them, I thought, was a shared belief, which could be described as a rejection of realism. But I think it goes kind of deeper than that. And I think it's something to do with their kind of quasi-religious belief in the perfectibility of dramatic form to express an inner self, a true inner self. I think this is a preoccupation of Craig throughout his whole life. The concept of perfection, which he manifests in the Uber Marionette, but in all of his work. And I think it's something that MacLeamore was obsessed with too, the kind of transcending the self in order to create a perfect artistic expression. So really, it isn't so much about the scenography, but rather about the beliefs around the scenography and the personalities that fueled the choices in their own scenography. I think in the future we might see a more direct comparison with images in the article. But for the moment, I think this is something that, as a director myself, I find very interesting. The kind of pull and push between ego and the creative process.
I think that there's a lot of resonances within your work. I mean, we don't really have time to tease these out, but I would urge people to go and look at the journal articles in Ian's work as well, and that idea of the kind of persona and the masquerade and the Uber marionette and the idea of the commedia, personas, etc. So really very interesting things being teased out across things. And I guess I think of scenography not just as a practice, but a set of ideas as well. So that idea of a set of shared beliefs lends to a kind of scenographic kind of approach to things, understanding of space and body and character, etc. Siobhan, maybe I might come to you a little bit, because MacLeamore, Molly McEwen came to work at the Gate, and but you know, you had interesting access to her papers in Scotland, but also access through kind of an oral history with relations of hers. And I think again, this is why we're so lucky to have Joe that we can talk to and ask him these questions. But MacLeamore doesn't come out terribly well, does he, out of the relatives' recollections of Molly's work? You're muted.
On mute, I know, it's like the phrase of our times, isn't it? You're on mute. But yeah, just to, you know, pick up on what Chris said as well about, like, you know, how important the biography or the background is, I guess, of the artist. Think about the work, and I guess to talk about the voice as well, with how you introduced us. I mean, that was something that really struck me when I was digging around in Molly's archive versus digging around the Gate archive. Where is her voice? You know, where is her personality? She just kind of is lost in all of this history. And it's interesting when you look at the Northwestern archive, I think there are 3 items in there attributed to McEwen, when in fact she did hundreds and hundreds of designs for the Gate, you know, ones that we wouldn't even think of, like, you know, ones that Joan mentioned in her article as well, where she just gets lost in history, I think. And I think, you know, part of the reason for that is the kind of gender politics of the time. And I think it's also, you know, her own personality. She was very shy and retiring. But also I think her relationship with Edwards and MacLeamore, and, you know, because her voice was absent, and I had to, because you directed me towards it actually, Elaine, the Scottish Society for Art History were, you know, given small grants for people if they wanted to go and research anything to do with artists in Scotland, and that's how I went to her archive in Glasgow. And when I went there, you know, I mentioned her voice was kind of absent, but I had to publish a report on what I did there, and that went into their newsletter, and her relatives actually came across that in that newsletter and got in touch with me and kind of reached out. So Sue Harries, her niece, I got in touch with first, and we had lots of chats, and that was really productive. So it was great to get to know Molly, the person, and of course that sheds light on who she was as an artist, but also why history has kind of forgotten her. I mean, even though she had a very successful career also in Glasgow, it was with popular theatre, and I think we tend to overlook that form sometimes and the importance of it. So I really appreciated Finian's contribution as well to this special issue event here today. So it was just really nice to kind of develop a rapport with her relatives, and they really want to talk about her and to find out more about her. But there are aspects of her, I think, that will always be lost. But what they did point out is, you know, stories that circulated in the family, family members being quite angry at how Edwards and MacLeamore treated her, You know, she kind of, you know, she went on holidays with them, but was kind of like, the famous one is in their family is that, you know, they took her to Egypt, but they never brought her to the pyramids. They just fecked off and, you know, and left her there. So Sue, her niece, reckons that she was kind of a bit of a skivvy for them. She followed them around. She was desperately in love with MacLeamore, apparently. She was so innocent that she didn't know that he was gay or didn't know what that was. And, you know, obviously she realized in time. But I mean, that kind of, you know, she was shy and retiring, and that relationship recurred, I think, when she went to work on the early Edinburgh Festival. She worked on the second ever Edinburgh Festival, on the Three Estates, that massive production that they did there with Tyrone Guthrie. And again, it was felt that her labour was being subsumed under his brand, very much so. And I think I kind of detected that when I looked at the archival stuff and saw images coming up there, and saw images that had been attributed to MacLeamore in the Gate archive that were in her archive in Scotland. So it was just interesting, and I kind of, you know, thought about, yeah, I mean, perhaps there's a lot more work that she did that we will never know because it's just lost to history. Because, you know, as Finian pointed out as well, those collaborative relationships are also often hierarchical, and sometimes, you know, women's labour in particular gets lost, I think.
I think also that it speaks to the ephemeral nature of theatre practice, is that, you know, those things don't often get kept, costumes and set designs and etc. And I suppose we're thankful that she had an archive, that maybe, you know, her lack of a social life and her quiet life meant that she kept everything and that she archived it all, and that, you know, we would really speak to the value of that. And I mean, I guess, Chris, even though we haven't been able to travel and that archives are inaccessible, I think as editors, one of the things that we've really noticed is that the increased digitization of resources has made our lives so much easier. And I think this is the way it's going to go forward. And that brings me really to talk to Joe really about the value of the designer's archive, because, you know, Joe's archive is down in Galway now, and it's really extensive. The beautiful, beautiful model boxes, images, set designs, costume designs, and also Joe's own book, Theatrescapes, in which he kind of comments on and talks about and remembers his practice. And so Joe's contribution, Joe, I just want to kind of go to you now, that your contribution is really valuable here, because it is the voice, and well done, Siobhan. It is not only the voice in your own voice, but it's actually, you know, your artistic voice as well. And, you know, your design work is there for us to enjoy. And I suppose you can speak more than anybody about the nature of the work of the designer, and how do you feel, you know, it seems to me you've had very productive working relationships with, but particularly writers and also directors. But, you know, can I ask you just to maybe reflect on working with writers? You've worked with writers like Brian Friel and Frank McGuinness and Hugo Hamilton, which Barry's already talked about the work that you've done with them. I mean, is there a particular kind of shorthand, or is there a particular kind of relationship that you like to cultivate with a writer, or how does it work for you?
Yes. Well, should we? Let me just have a think for a second. Let's talk about Brian Friel. I suppose the thing about Brian in a way is, or was, in his writing and his stage directions, pretty set in his ways. And I think the thing that surprised me when I started working with him and on his plays was the extent to which somebody who I thought was rather rigid and rather formal was really prepared to run in completely different directions when I came back with alternative suggestions to how I felt this piece should be staged. I don't want to go, obviously, go back and start with Lunacy, for instance, but I mean that whole idea of the wheat field and the poppies, which of course was a response to the whole atmosphere of the play, was one example of something that he was so surprised by. But what was surprised was he was prepared to run with it. Going to the Gate productions, Molly Sweeney was an incredible play which he saw as a very black, static world, and I pushed it in a completely different direction. And as I've written in the article, my surprise was he was prepared to go with it. Performances is another example of his play about Janacek, where he had a very specific idea of the environment, but when I went and researched it, I found a very different world and persuaded him to do something that related to what he was writing, but at the same time flipped it in a completely different direction. In order to understand what I'm talking about, you just need to read the article. So I think what is surprising is authors. I mean, Frank McGuinness, of course, was always prepared to run with it as many different directions as you could offer him. And of course, it wasn't just me; it was Patrick Mason at the same time. The two of us acting in performing or acting in sync as design director duo. Hugo Hamilton, to a certain extent, was very flexible in the sense that there were no footprints, in a sense, in his instructions for both the Speckled People and the Mariner. So again, it was very back to me with Patrick again to tease out underlying themes in the play and try and find an angle that was probably more abstract and less specific than the script itself gave rise to. So what am I saying? I'm just saying that it was a constant surprise that authors who I felt would be very, if you like, slavish about stick to this because this is what I've written, this is my viewpoint of it. I will jump now just to one other playwright, which is Tom Kilroy, who with Secret Fall of Constance Wildburn, and we're back at the Abbey now, he had a very specific visual take on it, which we didn't really question because it was so out there and so alternative in a way. There was no other way of going other than going back to something very traditional. So that's in the case of one author who came with a very specific visual response, a visual notion about how the play should be staged, and we just said, yeah, that's the play, that's the look of it, let's just do it.
Excellent, thank you, Joe. I'm conscious of time. I would urge you to particularly look at all three of the articles in my panel, because I think that one of the things that we've learned about working in the Gate Theatre Research Network as a general organisation, particularly here, is the value of design as part of theatre. Theatre is a visual medium, and I think that to a large extent, theatre histories in Ireland have tended to focus on play text and words and dramatic space rather than visual space. And we go to the theatre to see those worlds, and designers are really an integral part of creating those worlds for us to kind of lose ourselves in. So I'm going to actually hand you back to Siobhan. Am I going to hand it back to you, or Siobhan, or to Ian? I'm going to hand you back to Ian, I think. And I want to say just thanks to everybody, and please look at that article and please enjoy Joe's wonderful, wonderful designs.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, Elaine, in fact, sorry. I'll take the lead, I guess, in wrapping things up, and really just to say our thank yous, and please, co-editors, come in if there's things I forget, or if there's things that you want to add in relation to who we thank. But I guess we should start with what you kind of mentioned there at the end there, Elaine, which is the Gate Theatre Research Network, which is the organisation and the project indeed that has led to so many outputs on the Gate in recent times, and had 3 conferences, international conferences, and now has 3 publications to its credit, this being the last of those publications. So just to thank the directors of the Gate Theatre Research Network, Ruud van den Buchen, Marguerite Corporal, Andrzej Pilny, and indeed Patrick Lonergan as well. So to thank them initially, but then also, I guess, to thank the RISE editorial board. So we were looking for a 3rd publication for the project, and we were very keen that the publication would also be, there's a kind of an ethos within the project that things would be open access and available to everybody. So we were so delighted when RISE accepted our proposal for this particular publication, because again, it is online and accessible. And thanks to Shane Alacobi Murphy in the first place in accepting our proposal and the editorial board for that decision. Since then, though, the support that we've received from Sean Crossan, I have to say, has been phenomenal in relation to steering this project forward, and the support that he's shown for it has been really wonderful. And then, of course, at the very end as well, himself and Katharina Renhark as well, the kind of the last minute editorial things that we missed that they also helped us out with was really fantastic for us. So they would be the primary people that we would like to thank. I think from my own perspective as well, I'd like to thank my colleagues, my family, my parents, and indeed my PhD students as well, who actually had quite an influence on me in relation to this, particularly my PhD student, Zuzana Balaz, who helped inspire me in relation to looking at the Commedia dell'arte in relation to aspects of queerness, which I hadn't actually, unfortunately, struck me until she brought this to my attention. So that's my thank yous, and maybe I can pass over to the others if they want to elaborate more. Elaine, Siobhan, do you want to?
I'll echo all of your thanks, Ian, as well, and I'll thank Alistair McEwen and Sue Harries and all of our contributors, and you both as co-editors as well, in addition to all the thanks you've already given.
And I'd just like to echo that. It's been a pleasure working with both of you. I think, Ian, you've done a lot of heavy lifting in the Gay Theatre Research Network, generally speaking, with editorial work. And that is really appreciated, because very often editorial work is quite invisible, but it's absolutely vital for getting something up and running and getting it out there. So I just want to thank you. And I'd like to thank EFACIS and RISE for supporting us as well. So thanks for that.
I'd also like to just thank my co-editors as well, which is the person I knew the people I would forget would be very important people. It has been such a pleasure to work on this publication with Elaine and Siobhan, and really inspiring. So just to thank you so much for that as well. And of course, I also forgot to thank the contributors as well, which it wouldn't be possible without them. So to thank them all. So I'm not sure how we wrap this up now, Sean. Do you want to tell us?
I'll just say a very few words just for... firstly, to thank everyone again, not to overlabor the thanks, but I should thank you again, as the editors of this issue, Ian, Siobhan and Elaine, and to all of the contributors. As I said at the beginning, we're immensely proud to have this issue. It is a really fascinating, extraordinarily and beautifully, stunningly illustrated issue that I would recommend anybody with an interest in not just in Irish theatre and gay theatre, but in Irish studies to read, to see and to access. And it's, as Ina said, it's freely available now to access on risejournal.eu. And just to finish, I just wanted to very quickly just mention that we have just what's forthcoming with RISE, just for those of you who hopefully will return to RISE once you've discovered this issue and you follow the future publications. As I said at the beginning, we're always very interested, and we welcome proposals for teamed issues and submissions of articles to RISE at EFACIS, that's RISE at EFACIS.eu. And we have two forthcoming issues. I'll just very quickly mention before I close. We have a teamed issue coming out in late autumn, early winter, on the poetry of Maeve McGuckian. This issue will be edited by Dr. Daniela Tianova, one of our editorial boards. And that will be followed by a teamed issue in spring of 2022 on Irish sexual liberation and its literatures, and that's been edited by Dr. Laura Sidora and Dr. Robert Brassou, and I'm delighted that both Laura and Robert were able to join us here for this session. And just to say that particular issue, we're still accepting proposals up until July the 15th. So if you go on to the RISE website again at risejournal.eu, you'll find under the CFP button the CFP and the email addresses of both Robert and Laura to submit those proposals. So thank you all again. Please go check us out, read RISE, read this issue, and stay with us for future wonderful issues as well. So thank you all and take care.